She was just cleaning the Apache's machine gun until the pilot saw the patch and froze. The sun had barely risen over the military airbase, casting a soft, golden light over the rows of helicopters parked in the hangar. The quiet morning was only broken by the occasional hum of machinery, the faint sound of aircraft engines starting up, and the distant chatter of military personnel preparing for another day of duty. Among them was Sarah, a mechanic who had spent the last 3 years working in the hangar, maintaining and repairing Apache helicopters. Sarah wasn't your typical mechanic. She was dedicated to her work, meticulous in every task she undertook. The airbase was bustling with activity, with soldiers and technicians moving from one aircraft to the next, but Sarah had a different routine. While many of the others worked on bigger tasks, like checking the engines or testing the flight systems, Sarah focused on the finer details. Today, she was assigned to clean and inspect the machine gun mounted on the Apache helicopter, a task that required precision and patience. She had grown accustomed to the task, having performed it countless times, but today it felt different. The morning light filtered through the open hangar doors, illuminating the workbench where she set out her tools. The soft clinking of metal on metal was the only sound that filled the space as she worked. With steady hands, she began dismantling the machine gun, ensuring each part was clean and ready for action. It wasn't glamorous work, but to Sarah it was essential. The machine gun was an integral part of the Apache, a helicopter designed for both attack and defense. It wasn't just about making sure the gun fired correctly. It was about ensuring that every component was in perfect condition. Each piece, from the trigger mechanism to the barrel, had to function flawlessly. For Sarah, this was the kind of work that brought her a sense of satisfaction. She liked knowing that her efforts contributed to the success of a mission, even if her role was often overlooked by others. As she worked, she glanced around the hangar. Most of the pilots were already preparing for their flights. She caught sight of one of them, Captain Hayes, walking towards the helicopter she was working on. He was a seasoned Apache pilot, known for his calm demeanor under pressure. Sarah had seen him around the hangar countless times, but never had much of a chance to speak with him. Like most of the pilots, he was always in a rush, heading off for missions or briefings. Sarah wasn't one to bother others, so she kept her head down, focusing on the task at hand. The sound of footsteps grew louder as Captain Hayes approached. Sarah continued her work, carefully inspecting the barrel of the machine gun. She didn't look up at him, not wanting to interrupt his thoughts. The last thing she wanted was to come across as unprofessional, but then something unexpected happened. "Is that the new cleaning procedure?" Captain Hayes asked, his voice cutting through the otherwise silent air. Sarah looked up, slightly startled. She hadn't realized he was standing so close. His gaze was fixed on the machine gun in her hands. She was caught off guard but quickly regained her composure. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady but polite. "The cleaning procedure was updated last month. It's more thorough, especially for the barrel and the firing mechanisms. Helps keep the gun in top shape." Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully. He was a man of few words, and his attention to detail was well known. Sarah had always admired his calmness in the face of danger. He wasn't like the other pilots who often bragged about their skills or missions. Hayes simply did his job and did it well. "I've always trusted your work, Sarah," he said with a slight smile, "but I didn't know you were into this kind of detail. You always seem so focused." Sarah felt a sense of pride at his words, though she tried not to show it too much. Compliments weren't something she was used to. She preferred her work to speak for itself. "It's all part of the job, Captain," she said, turning her attention back to the machine gun. She didn't want to keep him too long. After all, he probably had a flight briefing to attend. Hayes hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I'll leave you to it then," he said, giving a small nod before turning away. As he walked back toward the other pilots, Sarah couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. She had always worked in the shadows, ensuring everything was running smoothly without ever being in the spotlight. But today, something had changed. For a moment, she wasn't just a mechanic, she was a valued part of the team. She smiled to herself, wiping the sweat from her forehead as she resumed her work. The machine gun now gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the hangar. Sarah could hear the faint hum of the engines starting up in the background, signaling that the pilots were getting ready for their missions. She continued to clean and inspect every component, making sure nothing was overlooked. The work was repetitive, but it was necessary. And for Sarah, that was enough. She had spent hours working on the helicopter, carefully ensuring that everything was in perfect working order. But as the morning progressed, she noticed something unusual. A slight disturbance in the air seemed to follow Captain Hayes as he walked back into the hangar. He had stopped again, but this time, his eyes were not on the helicopter. They were focused on something else. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned to see what had caught his attention. There on her uniform was a small patch, a patch that she had worn for years without giving it much thought. The patch was a simple insignia, one that identified her as part of the support crew. But to Captain Hayes, it meant something more. His expression froze, and Sarah could see the shock in his eyes. For a moment, the bustling hangar seemed to fade away, and all that remained was the two of them, a mechanic and a pilot, standing across from each other, caught in an unexpected moment. Sarah didn't understand why Hayes had stopped in his tracks. She had never noticed anything special about the patch. It was just part of her uniform. But now, as she saw the stunned look on his face, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. She stood there, confused, waiting for him to speak. The seconds felt like minutes. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what had just occurred. Was it something about the patch? Was it something to do with her work? Captain Hayes took a deep breath, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might say something, but then he simply turned and walked away. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. Sarah stood there for a few seconds longer, still unsure of what had just transpired. She glanced down at the patch on her sleeve, but found nothing out of the ordinary. It was just a patch. But something about the way Hayes had reacted made her wonder if there was more to it. She returned to her work, the noise of the hangar slowly filtering back into her awareness. But for the rest of the day, she couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in her chest. What had Captain Hayes seen? Why had he reacted the way he did? And why was she left standing there, unsure of what to do next? The questions lingered in Sarah's mind as she finished cleaning the Apache's machine gun. The sun had fully risen now, and the airbase was buzzing with activity. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the air, something she didn't quite understand yet. The day seemed to drag on after the brief encounter with Captain Hayes. Sarah was used to long hours spent working in the hangar, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the constant flurry of activity. But today, something felt different. It was as if a shadow had been cast over the usual routine, one she couldn't quite explain. After finishing the machine gun inspection, Sarah moved on to check the avionics on another Apache. She carefully inspected the instruments, ensuring each one was calibrated and ready for flight. But her mind kept drifting back to that strange moment earlier, the way Captain Hayes had frozen when he saw her patch. His eyes had widened in recognition, and for a brief second it seemed like time had stopped. But then, just as quickly, he had turned and walked away without a word. Sarah had never really interacted with the pilots on a personal level. She did her job, they did theirs. There was no need for anything beyond that. But after what had happened earlier, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Why had Hayes reacted that way? What was it about the patch that had triggered such a strong response? The rest of the morning passed without incident, but Sarah couldn't help but glance around the hangar, hoping to see the captain again. She wanted to understand what had happened, but he didn't appear. The hours ticked by, and soon it was time for lunch. Sarah headed to the mess hall, hoping that a break would clear her head. As she entered the cafeteria, she spotted a few of the other mechanics sitting at a table, laughing and chatting. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to join them. Her mind was too preoccupied with the strange encounter. She found an empty table in the corner and sat down, absent-mindedly picking at her food. Her thoughts kept returning to Hayes. Why had he acted the way he did? Sarah had worn that same patch for years without thinking much of it. It was just part of her uniform, like the rest of her gear. But for some reason, Hayes had reacted as if he had seen a ghost. She could still see his face in her mind, the shock, the hesitation, the way he had just turned and walked away. It wasn't like him at all. As Sarah sat in the cafeteria, lost in thought, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around to see Lieutenant Davis, one of the senior pilots, standing behind her. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked, his friendly smile putting her at ease. "Of course," Sarah replied, offering him a small smile in return. Davis pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. He was a familiar face in the hangar, but unlike Hayes, He was known for being more approachable. They had worked together on a few repairs over the years, though their interactions had always been brief and professional. "You okay?" Davis asked, noticing that Sarah didn't seem quite like her usual self. He had been around long enough to recognize when something was off. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to explain what had been going on in her mind. She didn't want to make a big deal out of something that might not even be important, but Davis wasn't the type to let things slide easily. "I'm just a little confused," Sarah admitted, finally deciding to speak up. "Earlier, Captain Hayes saw my patch and he just froze." He didn't say anything, just turned and walked away. It was like he recognized it, but I don't know why. Davis looked thoughtful for a moment, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to piece together the situation. "That's strange," he said finally. "Hayes isn't usually the type to be caught off guard by something like that." Sarah nodded. "Exactly. I've never seen him act like that before. It's like something in that patch triggered some kind of memory for him." Davis leaned back in his chair, his expression pensive. "Well, Hayes has been around for a long time. Maybe it's tied to something from his past. You know, the kind of thing that people don't always talk about." Sarah frowned, but she appreciated Davis' insight. "But what could it be? It's just a patch. It's not like it means anything special." Davis gave her a reassuring smile. "You'd be surprised what a small thing like a patch can mean to someone. It might not seem like much to you, but it could carry a lot of weight for him." Sarah chewed on his words as she finished her meal in silence. She appreciated the advice, but it still didn't answer the question that was gnawing at her. What was so significant about that patch? She had seen plenty of people wear it, including other members of the maintenance crew. But no one had ever reacted the way Hayes had. She couldn't help but feel like she was missing something important. As lunch came to an end, Sarah decided to take a walk outside. The cool breeze felt refreshing after spending hours in the hangar. She strolled across the base, her mind racing with possibilities. She passed by rows of parked aircraft, the massive helicopters standing tall and imposing under the clear sky. Each one had a story to tell, a history of missions flown, lives saved, and battles fought. Sarah had always felt a sense of pride working with these machines. She had always known her role was crucial, even if it was behind the scenes. But now, after the encounter with Hayes, she wondered if there was more to her job than she had ever realized. As she walked, Sarah spotted a familiar figure in the distance. It was Captain Hayes, standing by his Apache, talking to a few of the other pilots. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was her chance to figure out what had happened. She took a deep breath and walked toward him, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. When she reached the group, Hayes looked up and met her gaze. His expression was neutral, but Sarah noticed the way his eyes lingered on her for just a moment longer than usual. The others continued their conversation, oblivious to the tension between them. "Captain," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her stomach. "Can we talk for a moment?" Hayes glanced at the others, then nodded, excusing himself from the group. He motioned for Sarah to follow him to the side, away from the noise of the hangar. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was it. She was finally going to get answers. "What's on your mind, Sarah?" Hayes asked, his tone polite but distant. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to keep her nerves in check. "Earlier, you saw my patch. I didn't understand why you reacted the way you did. Is there something I should know?" Hayes was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," he said, his gaze flickering to the ground. "It's just that Patch reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone who meant a lot to me." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Who?" Hayes took a deep breath, and for the first time, Sarah saw a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "It's something I don't talk about much, but that patch, it was worn by someone I lost a long time ago. Someone who served in the same unit as me. We were close, and when they didn't come back from a mission, it hit me harder than I expected." Sarah's heart went out to him. She had never imagined that a simple patch could hold so much emotion. She hadn't realized that something as small as a uniform insignia could carry so much history and so much pain. "I didn't mean to bring up painful memories," she said softly. I didn't know." Hayes nodded, his expression softening. "It's not your fault, Sarah. It's just sometimes these things hit you when you least expect them. The patch reminded me of a time I'd rather forget, but it also made me realize how much I miss that person. It's something I've never really talked about with anyone." Sarah nodded, understanding the depth of his feelings. She could see now that there was more to him than the quiet, professional pilot she had always known. Beneath the surface, there was a man who had experienced loss and carried it with him, silently, for years. "I'm glad you told me," Sarah said quietly. "I can't imagine what it must have been like, but if you ever want to talk more, I'm here." Hayes gave her a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks, Sarah, I appreciate that." As Sarah turned to leave, she felt a sense of understanding between them that hadn't existed before. She had learned something about Captain Hayes, something personal and important, and in return, she had shared a part of herself with him. For the first time, she felt a true connection with the people she worked alongside, beyond the machinery and the tasks at hand. The days following the conversation with Captain Hayes were filled with a quiet understanding between Sarah and the pilot. It wasn't something that needed to be spoken about again, but there was a shift in their dynamic. Whenever their paths crossed in the hangar, there was a slight nod, a look of mutual respect, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the shared moment they'd experienced. For Sarah, it was a reminder that people carried more than just the weight of their uniforms. They carried personal histories, losses, and memories that shaped who they were. But the mystery of the patch lingered in the back of her mind. Hayes had opened up about the loss of someone close to him, someone who had worn that same patch. Sarah had learned that the patch was more than just a symbol of the maintenance crew. It was a relic of something much deeper, a connection to a past that Hayes had tried to bury. She couldn't help but wonder who that person was, how they had met, and what had happened to them. As the week wore on, Sarah continued her work, focused on her responsibilities, but always with a small curiosity tugging at the back of her thoughts. She had spent years working on the same base, repairing helicopters, maintaining machine guns, and ensuring that the aircraft were ready for flight. But it was moments like these, moments when the world beyond the machinery came into focus, that reminded her of the bigger picture. One morning, as Sarah entered the hangar, she was greeted by an unexpected sight. Hayes was standing beside his Apache helicopter, looking over the machine with a thoughtful expression on his face. It was unusual for him to be out there so early, and even more unusual for him to be alone. Most pilots were either in the briefing room or preparing for their next mission. Sarah walked over to him, a little hesitant, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something more to be learned. She had already seen a different side of him, a side that spoke of vulnerability, and it intrigued her. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than he had shared. "Morning, Captain," Sarah called out, breaking the silence. Hayes looked up, surprised, but then smiled when he saw it was her. "Morning, Sarah, you're here early today." "I could say the same about you," she replied, trying to keep the conversation light. "What's going on?" Hayes gave a small shrug, though there was a tension in his posture that Sarah couldn't ignore. "Just thinking. A lot has been on my mind lately." Sarah nodded, understanding. She could tell that the past few days had weighed on him. He hadn't mentioned much since their last conversation, but she could see that the memory of his lost comrade had stayed with him. It was clear that something deeper was troubling him, something he hadn't fully come to terms with. She stood beside him, not saying anything at first, but offering him the silent support he seemed to need. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hangar was peaceful, the only sound the hum of machines in the background, and the occasional distant voice from other parts of the base. Finally, Hayes broke the silence, his voice low. "You know, Sarah, when I saw that patch on your uniform, it took me back to a time I didn't want to revisit. I didn't even know it was still there, lurking beneath the surface." Sarah turned to face him, her curiosity growing. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said gently. Hayes shook his head, a small sigh escaping his lips. "No, it's okay. I've been holding it in for a long time, but I think it's time I tell someone. The person who wore that patch, it was my best friend. We joined the army together, trained together, and flew together. We had each other's backs through everything. There wasn't a mission we couldn't handle, or at least that's what we thought." Sarah could hear the pain in his voice, the raw emotion that came with sharing something so personal. She didn't interrupt, letting him speak at his own pace. "One day, we were sent on a mission to a hostile area. It was supposed to be a routine operation, just like all the others, but something went wrong. There was an ambush, and everything happened so fast. My friend, he didn't make it out. I did, and I've carried the weight of that ever since. Every mission, every flight, I think about that day. I think about him, And when I saw that patch, it was like I was right back there in that moment, reliving it. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She could see now that the patch wasn't just a symbol of military service. It was a symbol of loss, of a friendship that had been shattered in an instant. Hayes hadn't just lost a comrade, he had lost someone who had been like a brother to him. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. I can't imagine how hard that must have been, but I'm glad you're opening up about it. I know it's not easy. Hayes looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Thanks, Sarah. It's just been hard to talk about. I've always kept it to myself, thinking that if I didn't acknowledge it, it would somehow go away. But it hasn't. And seeing that patch, it was like everything came flooding back. Sarah understood the feeling. She had her own struggles, her own losses that she kept buried deep inside. It wasn't easy to open up, especially to someone who hadn't experienced the same things. But in that moment, she felt a connection to Hayes that went beyond their roles on the base. They were two people, both carrying burdens that they couldn't forget, but also learning how to share those burdens with each other. I'm sorry for what you've been through, Sarah said softly. But you're not alone, Captain. We all have our battles, our scars. But we can't carry them alone forever. Sometimes it's okay to let someone in. Hayes nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. I know, and maybe, just maybe, talking about it is the first step. They stood together for a moment longer, the weight of the conversation settling between them, but not in a burdensome way. There was a sense of relief in the air, a feeling that both of them had shared something deeply personal and had been able to understand each other in a way that went beyond words. As the morning wore on, Hayes seemed lighter, his posture less tense than it had been when Sarah first approached him. He had finally allowed himself to confront the past, and while the pain didn't vanish, there was a sense of healing that had begun. You know, Sarah said as they prepared to part ways, I don't think I've ever really thought about the impact of something as simple as a patch. But now I see it for what it truly is, a reminder of everything we've been through, of the people we've lost, and of the bonds that tie us together. Hayes smiled again, this time more warmly. I couldn't have said it better myself. As Sarah walked away, she felt a sense of connection to him that she hadn't felt before. It wasn't just about the mechanics or the machine guns or the helicopters anymore. It was about the people behind them, the stories they carried, the struggles they faced, and the strength they found in each other. Sarah had learned that sometimes the smallest things could hold the heaviest weight. And in that moment, she realized that there was a lot more to her job than she had ever imagined. She had always been a part of the team, but now she understood that her place in the world was not just about the machines she maintained. It was about the people who relied on her work and the unspoken connections that tied them all together. And that, she thought, was something truly worth fighting for. The days that followed the conversation with Captain Hayes felt different. There was a sense of calm in the air, as if both Sarah and Hayes had come to terms with something unspoken between them. The usual noise of the hangar, the clanging of tools, the whir of machines, was now punctuated by an undercurrent of understanding. Sarah could sense it. She wasn't just another mechanic, and Hayes wasn't just another pilot. They were two people, each carrying their own burdens, and for once, those burdens weren't something they had to face alone. As Sarah continued her work in the hangar, she found herself reflecting more on the conversation they'd had. It wasn't just about the patch. It was about everything that came with it, the loss, the memories, the pain of knowing that someone you loved would never come back. Hayes had opened up about the soldier he had lost, someone who had been like a brother to him. But there was more to the story, Sarah was sure of it. Hayes had only shared a small part of his past, and even though she could sense he was beginning to heal, there was still something missing. Sarah felt the need to understand more, to know the full story. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he hadn't told her, something important that was still holding him back. One morning, as she walked into the hangar to begin her day, she saw Hayes standing by his Apache once again. This time, however, he wasn't alone. There was another pilot with him, someone she hadn't seen before. The two of them were deep in conversation, their heads bent close as they exchanged words. Sarah couldn't hear what they were talking about, but from the way Hayes' face looked, she could tell it wasn't an ordinary conversation. Curious, she made her way over to them, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was going on. As she approached, Hayes looked up and noticed her, his expression softening as he greeted her. "Morning, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warmth. "Morning, Captain," she replied, offering him a small smile. "What's going on?" Hayes glanced at the other pilot, who had now turned to walk away. "Just a quick check on some equipment," he explained. "Nothing too serious, but it's good to see you. You're looking well." Sarah noticed that his tone seemed lighter than it had been in the past. She was beginning to think that perhaps their conversation had allowed him to release some of the emotional weight he had been carrying. But she still felt a tug at her heart. There was something more to his story. She wasn't sure if he would share it, but she couldn't help but wonder what had truly happened to his friend. Before she could say anything else, Hayes spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I've been meaning to talk to you, Sarah. There's something I think you should know." About the patch. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for him to say something, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this. She nodded, her attention fully on him. "I didn't tell you everything last time," Hayes continued, his gaze shifting downward for a moment. "The truth is, when I saw that patch, it reminded me of more than just the loss of my friend. It reminded me of the bond we shared, a bond that went beyond the military. We were close, closer than brothers. We had dreams, plans for the future. We thought we would always have each other's backs." Sarah listened intently, her mind racing. She could sense the heaviness in his voice, the weight of the emotions he was struggling to express. "But when he died," Hayes said, his voice cracking slightly, "it wasn't just a loss of a comrade. It was the loss of someone who had been my family. And for years, I couldn't come to terms with it. I buried the memories, tried to move on, but it never went away. That patch, it was a constant reminder of him. And every time I saw it, I thought of what we could have been, what we could have done if he had just come back." Sarah could feel the rawness of his words. She had no idea how deeply Hayes had been affected by his friend's death. She had seen him as a composed, professional pilot, but now she saw the pain that lay beneath the surface. "I never really let myself grieve properly," Hayes continued. "I just threw myself into the job, into the mission, thinking that if I kept moving forward, it would go away. But it didn't, and when I saw you with that patch, it was like a flood of memories came rushing back. I realized that I had never truly faced what happened. I had never given myself the chance to mourn." Sarah's heart went out to him. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to lose someone so close, someone who had been a part of your life in such a deep and meaningful way. She could see now that the patch wasn't just a symbol of military service. It was a symbol of all the things Hayes had lost, his friend, his future, his sense of stability. "You don't have to go through this alone, Captain," Sarah said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm here, and I think you know that now. You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Hayes looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I know, and I appreciate that more than you know, Sarah. I guess I just didn't want to admit how much it still hurt. But I think talking about it, even just with you, is helping. I've kept it inside for so long, and now, for the first time, I feel like I'm starting to let it go." Sarah smiled softly, her own heart lighter knowing that Hayes was finally beginning to heal. "It's a start, Captain. And sometimes that's all we can do, take it one step at a time." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation lingering in the air. Sarah had always known that there was more to the people around her than what appeared on the surface. But now, she had come to understand the depth of the connection that bound them all together. It wasn't just about the work they did. It was about the shared experiences, the moments of vulnerability, and the strength that came from supporting one another. Hayes broke the silence with a small laugh. "You know, Sarah, I've never been one to talk about my feelings. But for some reason, talking to you feels easier. Maybe it's because you don't judge me, you just listen." Sarah shrugged, smiling. "It's not about judgment, it's about being there for each other. We all have our stories, our battles. Sometimes we just need someone to share them with." Hayes nodded, his smile growing a little wider. "You're right, and I'm grateful for that." As they stood there, talking about the past and the future, Sarah realized how much she had learned from this experience. It wasn't just about the helicopters, the machines, or the missions. It was about the people who made up the team, the pilots, the mechanics, the soldiers, each with their own stories, each carrying their own burdens. She had started this journey as just a mechanic, doing her job and keeping the helicopters in top shape. But now, she understood that her role was so much more than that. She wasn't just maintaining machines. She was maintaining the connections between people, helping them heal, and offering a safe space for them to share their burdens. As the day went on, Sarah continued her work, but her heart was lighter. She had learned that sometimes the most unexpected moments, like a patch, a shared memory, or a simple conversation, could be the key to understanding the deeper connections between people. And in that, she found a sense of fulfillment that she had never experienced before. The airbase was bustling with its usual activities, but for Sarah, everything seemed different. The conversation with Captain Hayes had left her with a sense of clarity. The heaviness that had hung between them in the past weeks had slowly started to lift. There was no longer an unspoken tension whenever their paths crossed, and Sarah found herself smiling more as she worked. She had learned something about herself and about the people she worked with, something that went beyond the technicalities of her job. As days turned into weeks, Sarah's routine in the hangar remained mostly the same. She continued her work on the helicopters, checking systems, cleaning machine guns, and ensuring everything was in top condition. But now her focus was sharper. She had a new understanding of the role she played in the lives of the pilots and crew members. She wasn't just a mechanic who fixed machines. She was part of something bigger. She was helping keep the team together, ensuring that they could continue their missions safely and effectively. But Sarah knew that the sense of connection she had with Hayes was not the only thing that had changed. He had changed too. He was more open now, not just with her but with others as well. He would often stop by the hangar to check on her work, offering encouragement or simply making small talk. His smile, which had once seemed distant, now seemed genuine. There was a lightness in his demeanor that Sarah hadn't noticed before. One afternoon, as Sarah was tightening a bolt on one of the Apache helicopters, she saw Hayes walking toward her. He was alone, and his pace was slower than usual, as though he had something on his mind. Sarah wiped her hands on a rag and stood up, giving him a friendly nod. "Hey, Captain," she greeted him with a smile. "Hey, Sarah," Hayes replied, returning her smile. There was a pause, and Sarah could sense that he was about to say something important. "You've been on my mind lately," Hayes began, his voice low but steady. "I've been thinking a lot about the things we talked about, and I want to thank you for being there for me. It's not easy to open up about that stuff, but I'm glad I did." Sarah nodded, her own heart warmed by his words. She had never expected anything in return when they had spoken so openly. It was simply what felt right at the time, a moment of shared understanding. But hearing Hayes express his gratitude made her realize how much of an impact they had both had on each other. "It wasn't a big deal, Captain," she said with a shrug. "We all have our stories, our struggles. Sometimes we just need someone to listen." Hayes chuckled softly. "I guess that's true, but still I appreciate it more than you know." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction in knowing that she had helped him. But Hayes wasn't finished. He looked at her more seriously, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pause. "You know," he continued, "I've been carrying that pain for so long, thinking that I had to do it alone. But the truth is, we're all in this together. You've shown me that, and it's something I'll never forget." Sarah felt her chest tighten at his words. She had never thought of herself as someone who could change another person's outlook on life. But in that moment, she realized she had done just that. She had helped Hayes open up, not just to her, but to the people around him as well. "I'm glad I could help," Sarah said softly, her voice full of sincerity. Hayes stood there for a moment longer as if contemplating something. Finally, he spoke again. "I know I've been distant in the past," he said, his tone more serious now. "But I want to make up for that. I want to be more involved, not just with the missions, but with the people I work with. You've taught me something important, Sarah. I've spent too long focusing only on the job, but there's so much more to life than that. I want to be a better person, and I think you've helped me realize how to do that." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to him. She had never expected their conversation to have such a lasting effect on him. She had simply shared her thoughts, her empathy, without any intention of changing his life. But now, hearing him speak this way, she realized that sometimes the smallest gestures could have the biggest impact. "I think you're already doing it, Captain," Sarah said with a smile. "It's never easy to open up, but you've done it, and that's the first step." Hayes smiled back at her, his eyes brighter than they had been in a long time. "I suppose you're right," he said. "Thanks, Sarah, you've helped me more than you know." With that, he turned and walked back toward the other pilots. But this time, Sarah noticed a spring in his step, a renewed sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. She couldn't help but feel proud of him, proud of the journey he had begun, a journey toward healing and growth. As the days continued, Sarah and Hayes continued to share small moments of connection. Sometimes it was a brief conversation in the hangar. Other times it was a shared look across the room. Whatever it was, Sarah felt that their bond had become stronger, not just because of the conversation they had had, but because of the mutual respect that had formed between them. They weren't just colleagues anymore, they were friends. And for Sarah, that meant more than anything. One day, a few weeks later, Sarah was sitting at her workbench when she noticed Hayes standing at the entrance of the hangar. He was talking to one of the other pilots, but his eyes kept drifting toward her, as though he was waiting for something. Sarah stood up, wiping her hands on a rag, and made her way over to him. "Everything okay, Captain?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. Hayes looked at her, his face serious. "Actually, yes," he said, his tone still calm but with a certain excitement in his voice. "I've been thinking. We've been talking a lot about the past, but I think it's time we look ahead. There's a mission coming up, and I want you on the team. I know it's not exactly your usual role, but I think you'd be a huge asset. What do you say?" Sarah blinked in surprise. She had never been included in a mission briefing before, let alone invited to be part of an actual mission. She had always been the one working behind the scenes, making sure the helicopters were ready for flight. But this was different. Hayes was offering her a chance to be a part of something bigger, a chance to be a part of the team in a way she had never imagined. "I'm honored, Captain," Sarah said, her heart racing. "But are you sure? I mean, I'm not a pilot, I'm just a mechanic." Hayes smiled, his eyes glinting with a newfound confidence. "You're more than just a mechanic, Sarah. You've already proven that, and I think it's time you prove it to yourself, too." Sarah felt a sense of pride swell within her chest. For the first time, she was being seen as more than just the person who fixed the machines. She was being seen as a valuable member of the team, someone who had something to contribute beyond the routine tasks. She couldn't help but feel excited for what lay ahead. "Let's do it," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I'm ready." And so Sarah's journey continued, but now it had a new direction. She had always been part of the team, but now she was going to step into a new role, one that would allow her to grow and contribute in ways she had never imagined. It was a small step, but it was a step toward a future filled with possibilities, both for her and for the people she worked alongside. As she walked with Hayes toward the briefing room, Sarah couldn't help but think about how far she had come. From a quiet mechanic in the background to someone who had forged real connections and was now being given the opportunity to make a difference in ways she had never expected. She was ready for whatever came next. The days after Sarah's conversation with Captain Hayes felt like a new chapter had begun, not just for her, but for the entire team. The hangar, usually filled with the mechanical noises of helicopters being worked on, now had an undercurrent of excitement and anticipation. Everyone seemed to be moving with purpose, as though something important was on the horizon. Sarah had been invited to be a part of a new mission, something she had never expected. She had always been the one behind the scenes, the person who made sure the helicopters were ready for flight, but now she was going to be part of the team in a way she had never imagined. As Sarah prepared for the mission, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had always known that her role in the military was important, but now she understood that it went beyond just fixing things. Her work mattered, and she had seen firsthand how the connections between the people on the base made all the difference. The work they did was not just about machines. It was about people, the pilots, the mechanics, the soldiers, all working together to achieve a common goal. Sarah spent the next few days preparing for the mission. She wasn't sure exactly what her role would be, but she was determined to prove herself. She spent long hours in the hangar, checking every detail, ensuring that the helicopters were in top shape. She worked alongside the other mechanics, all of them focused on getting the job done. But this time, there was a new energy in the air. Sarah was no longer just one of the team. She was now an active participant in something bigger. When the day of the mission finally arrived, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She had always been good at her job, but this was different. She wasn't just maintaining the helicopters anymore. She was going to be there with the pilots, supporting them in a real mission. It was a small step for her, but it was a giant leap in her journey. She walked into the briefing room where the team was gathered. The room was filled with the usual buzz of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, and the shuffle of papers. But when Sarah walked in, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle, but it was there. The pilots and mechanics all nodded at her, acknowledging her presence in a way they never had before. Sarah was part of this team now, and it was clear that they respected her. Captain Hayes was standing at the front of the room, looking over the mission details. When he saw Sarah enter, he gave her a brief smile. There was a new sense of camaraderie between them, something that had developed over the past few weeks. Hayes had shared his past with her, and Sarah had learned that their connection went deeper than just the work they did. They were both people with histories, struggles, and hopes for the future, and now they were standing side by side, ready to face whatever the mission would bring. "All right, everyone, gather around," Hayes called, his voice steady and commanding. The room quieted as everyone took their seats, their attention focused on him. "We've got a big task ahead of us today. We're going into a potentially dangerous area, and we need to be ready for anything. Our job is to secure the zone, neutralize any threats, and ensure the area is safe for the team to move in. Sarah," he said, turning to look at her, "I'm glad you're with us today. Your attention to detail is exactly what we need." Sarah's heart swelled with pride at his words. She had never expected to be given such an important role. She had always worked in the background, never fully recognized for the effort she put into her work. But today, she was being seen. She was being valued for more than just the person who fixed the helicopters. She was part of the team, and she was ready to prove it. The mission details were laid out, and the team went over their roles and responsibilities. Hayes would be leading the team in the air, coordinating the efforts of the pilots, while Sarah and the other mechanics would be on the ground, supporting them. Everyone had a job to do, and everyone understood the importance of working together. The mission was bigger than any one person. It was about the team as a whole. Once the briefing was over, Sarah gathered her tools and gear, making sure everything was in place. As she prepared to head out, she felt a rush of adrenaline. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was a part of the mission, a part of the team. The helicopters took off one by one, their engines roaring to life as they climbed into the sky. Sarah stood by, watching them disappear into the distance. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She was about to be part of something real, something that mattered. The work she had done in the hangar, the hours spent ensuring that every bolt and wire was secure, was all leading up to this moment. As the mission progressed, Sarah found herself in a role she hadn't expected. She was helping the pilots with communications, making sure they had the support they needed from the ground. She was also assisting with logistics, ensuring that the team had everything they needed to complete the mission successfully. She wasn't in the cockpit, but she was still making a difference. Every task she completed, no matter how small, played a vital role in the success of the mission. The team worked together seamlessly, each person relying on the others to get the job done. The pilots communicated with the ground crew. The mechanics ensured that everything was running smoothly, and Sarah played her part, staying calm under pressure and making sure everyone had what they needed. The mission was a success, and it was clear that they had achieved their goals because they had worked as a team. As they returned to the base, Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The mission had been challenging, but they had done it. They had come together, relied on each other, and supported each other in ways they hadn't before. For Sarah, it wasn't just about the success of the mission. It was about the connections that had been made, the trust that had been built. She had proven herself in ways she hadn't imagined, and she knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger. When they landed, Hayes came over to Sarah, his expression filled with pride. "You did great today," he said, his voice sincere. "You were a huge asset to the team. I knew you had it in you." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Captain. I couldn't have done it without the support of the team." Hayes nodded, his eyes softening. "We're all in this together. And you've earned your place here, Sarah. Never forget that." As the team gathered around to debrief and discuss the mission, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had started as a mechanic, just another face in the hangar, but now she was part of something bigger. She was part of a team, a group of people who relied on each other and who understood that the work they did wasn't just about machines. It was about the people who made those machines work and the bonds they formed along the way. As the team celebrated their success, Sarah felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known before. This wasn't just a job. It was a mission. It was a life, and she was a part of it. She had found her place, and she had proven to herself that she was capable of more than she had ever realized. And as the sun set over the airbase, Sarah knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was ready for them. She had found her place in the team, and now she was going to continue moving forward, one step at a time.